the reason I include problem 21 is to show you that the application of these concepts, what we're doing, please turn off your mics, what we're doing with capital budgeting and cost of capital is how you value a company. So if in the future you're looking at buying another firm, or someone is bringing to you a proposal to buy another firm, you'll see the volume of assumptions that go into this, but you'll see how applicable this is to valuing a company as well. And so I'm going to walk through, and this problem is the whole book kind of on steroids, because it's a little bit harder than some of the other problems we've been doing. But what I'd like you to do is I'm going to put you back in your breakouts for a few minutes. Yeah, that time. And the only part of this I want you to do is I want you to do the weighted average cost of capital. And it's kind of nice and easy because they give you the cost of debt and cost of equity. You have to calculate the market values and then add them together. So I want you to calculate your weighted average cost of capital, and I want you to read the rest of the problem and think about it. Okay, and I'm going and talk about it in your breakouts, because I want you to think about how would you go about approaching this problem. That's the most important thing to me, is that you figure out how to approach it. I'll work the problem so that you'll see how to do the operating cash flows and such. But do calculate your weighted average cost of capital in your breakouts, and then read the entire problem. And if you can start to set it up, great, but certainly give it some thought so that when I talk, it will make a little bit more sense. Does that make sense? Okay, breakouts are opened again, and I'll pull you back in at 8:30, so you got about 12 minutes. And I'm trying to put you in a room. Here we go. Okay, I think everybody is back now. And problem 21 is just a capital budgeting problem, but it's applied in a different way. Now we're thinking about buying a company. And I think whenever you're looking at problems in the real world, there's so much information that's thrown your way. So the first thing to do is factor through and figure out what's important and what's relevant. So we know that Happy Times has 140 million in debt, and the cost of debt is 6%. And they've got 380 million in equity, and the cost of equity is 11%. Then they talk about Joe's party having 40 million in debt. Why do we need that information? Any idea?
Because if they buy it, they have to assume the debt.
Excellent. So if we buy the company, so if we're going to buy Joe's, what we're going to buy is the equity in the company. So when we value the firm, we're coming up with an overall value, and we're going to have to subtract that 40 million out later to figure out what is the value of the equity, because that's what we're going to pay for. John's exactly right. We're going to assume that debt. We're going to have to pay it, but we're not going to pay for that 40 million in debt. That's just going to reduce the overall cost of what we're going to pay for the company, because we're going to have to pay back that debt as well. It starts with an EBIT number in the first year of 16.8 million, and it tells us the EBIT's going to grow at 10% for the next 5 years, and then it's going to slow down and grow at 3% forever. And as soon as it tells us it's going to do something forever, we know we can use that dividend discount model. It's called the Gordon growth model, which is the dollar amount times 1 plus the growth rate over the R minus G. So that's going to give us a terminal value. It says each year that net working capital needs to be 9% of EBIT, and capital spending is 15% of EBIT, and depreciation is 8%. Per year, and then there's 1.9 million shares outstanding, tax rate of 38%, and EBITDA multiple of 8%. Whew. Lots of information. Okay, let's do the weighted average cost of capital first. Would anybody like to share how you went about the weighted average cost of capital? Corey, how about you?
Okay, for the weighted average cost of capital, they gave you the two rates for the debt, which was 6%, and for the equity, which was 11%. And then they gave you the two values too at 140 million and 380. So the ratios came down to, for your equity, came down to 73.08, and for debt, 26.92. So your weighted average cost of capital was 9.04. I hope.
I think that sounds pretty accurate. Okay, so we have 140 million of debt, and altogether we have debt plus equity is 140 million plus 380 million, or 520 million. So 26.92% of our financing is with debt. For equity, the rest of it, 380 million divided by the total financing, which is the 520 million, tells me that my percentage of equity financing is 73.08%. So for my cost of capital, I don't have to do a CAPM. They gave me my cost of equity at 11%. I don't have to find the yield to maturity to IY for our cost of debt. They gave it to us. But they gave it the regular cost of debt. They didn't give us the after-tax cost of debt. So what we are going to do is we're going to take the 73% debt financing, 73% equity financing times the cost of equity at 11%, 26% debt financing times the cost of debt after tax, tells me that my overall weighted average cost of capital is 9.04%. What questions do you have with that part of it? Everybody feeling pretty comfortable with getting that cost of capital? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Ordinarily, when we buy a company, we're looking at, we're going to forecast out the revenues for that firm and their costs if we buy them and if we own them. So we look at synergies and those kinds of things. In this case, they simplified it for us. We don't have to figure out all the revenues and the costs. They said EBIT. So they subtracted out the cost from revenue to come up with an EBIT number. And they said in the first year, it's going to be 16.8 million, and then it will grow at 10% for 5 years and then grow at 3% thereafter. So that's where we're going to start. We're setting up pro forma statements. And when I put this page up, please just look at line by line as I tell you. Otherwise, you look at it and your eyes cross because it looks more complex than it actually is. Okay, so what do we have? We have 16.8 million in the first year, which they gave us. That's going to grow by 10% per year for each year. So 16.8 times 1.1 is going to give me 18.48. And it's going to grow to the 20.3. So I've got my EBIT for each of the 5 years. Okay, I need to know taxes because when we create pro forma statements, then what we do for capital budgeting problems is we need to convert them into cash flows. And so we need to know what our taxes are going to be. They tell us the tax rate is 38%. And the reason we just do the taxes on EBIT is, remember, when we're doing capital budgeting problems, we ignore interest expense. So ordinarily in a pro forma, it would be EBIT minus interest expense to get to EBT, earnings before taxes, times the tax to get to our net income. We leave interest expense out, so we can go from EBIT right to figuring out the tax. So 38% of this 16.8 is 6.384. 38% of 18.48 is 7,022,000. And if we subtract the 6.3 million from the 16.8, I come up with this pro forma net income number. Okay, what questions do you have at that point on how we got to the net income numbers? Everybody comfortable with these numbers? Okay. What's the formula to calculate the operating cash flow? Who remembers that one? We want to find our operating cash flow. It's our EBIT plus depreciation minus taxes. So remember, we're trying to get as close to a cash number as we can get. So we take EBIT, which is pretty good, but depreciation has been subtracted out from there. So we need to add depreciation back in. And then we subtract out taxes because taxes are a cash cost that we need to pay attention to. Okay. So if we're going to get to EBIT plus depreciation minus taxes, we need to know what depreciation is. And so because it's already come out up here, EBIT had sales less all of the costs, including depreciation, before you get to EBIT. We need to figure out depreciation number, and they tell us it's 8%. So if we calculate 8% of the 16.8 million, it's 1.3 million. So do you see where that depreciation number is coming from? It's 8% of EBIT each year. And that's what they told us. That's just a given number. That's not a standard thing. They just told us that's the number. So when you look at this sheet, it seems a little weird to see depreciation down here. We usually see it up here, but that's because it's already been taken out. And the only reason it's down here, this is not where you would ever see it in pro forma. This is just a place to have it so I know what those depreciation numbers are, because I need them for my operating cash flows. Okay, so now my operating cash flow formula is EBIT plus depreciation minus taxes. So it's EBIT, add to that depreciation, and then subtract out taxes to get to this 11.76 million. And you can check me, make sure my math is right. But it was in Excel, so hopefully it will be. So each year I look at my EBIT, add back depreciation, and then subtract out taxes. And that gets me these numbers right here. Okay, what questions do you have now? Okay, when we're buying a company, much like when we're looking at a capital budgeting project, when we're looking at a capital budgeting project, we want operating cash flows if we undertake it. We also want to look at what kind of capital spending we're going to have. You know, remember, oftentimes we spend up front to build a new factory, and then we sometimes have salvage at the end. Most of the problems we've done have not had capital spending in between, other than the start and at the end. But if you think about a company, Tesla's a great example. As Tesla's continuing to grow and they're trying to build faster, what they're continuing to do is build out their capital spend. They're building more factories, putting in new machinery to help work. So when you acquire a company, very frequently you have capital expenditures each year. You know, usually they do at least enough capital expenditures to offset the depreciation that causes your fixed assets to decline. So for this company, they said that our capital spending each year is going to be 15% of EBIT. So every year we're going to spend 15% of EBIT. So how do I get this number? I take 15% times this 16.8 million, and I do that each year. So this 33.354 is equal to this 22 million times 15%. Okay, the only other thing we need is, if you think back to our capital budgeting problems, very frequently we had working capital. Sometimes we just had initial working capital and then we recovered it all at the end. But sometimes we had incremental increases in working capital over time. For this company, if we buy Joe's, they're going to need to spend in net working capital 9% of EBIT each year. So each year we take a look at EBIT and multiply that by 9%. To get to these working capital needs. Now, let's go back to chapter 2. Okay, is operating cash flow a cash inflow or a cash outflow? Is it a source or a use of capital? Operating cash flow. It's a positive number. Is it a source or a use?
Use.
Good. No. Operating cash flow. No. Operating cash flow, if it's positive, it's a source. It's the cash flow coming into the company from operations. So operating cash flow is typically positive, much like when we looked at the cash flow statement, those operating cash flows, we said if a company has negative operating cash flows, they're losing money every time they produce their products. So we typically look for a positive operating cash flow. What about capital spending? Is that typically a source or a use? John, redeem yourself.
Capital spending would be a use.
Yay, good. So operating cash flow is what you get in from operations. Capital spending is what you're spending. That's a use. So you're subtracting out what you're increasing in capital spending each year. What about working capital? Janet, is working capital a source or a use? John, go ahead. Give us working capital.
That's what I was looking at when I said use the first time.
Oh, okay.
Having a brain fart, a senior moment.
Not a problem. So what is working capital? Is it a source or a use?
It's a use.
It's a use.
Yeah. Typically, our working capital is increasing as our company is growing. So as Tesla is in the next month they're going to work 24 hours a day. They got to bring in a whole bunch of steel, a whole bunch of parts in order to build all of these new cars. Turn off your mics, please. So net working capital typically is a use each year. So we have our operating cash flows each year. We have operating cash flow, and then we subtract from that our capital spending and our net working capital to get our cash flow from assets each year. Okay, so we take our operating cash flow, subtract out the capital spending, that use of money, subtract out the building up of our net working capital to arrive at our our cash flow from assets each year for the 5 years. So now, this spreadsheet's not as bad as it looks. It's a challenge, but you have seen all of this before. Okay, what's the life of a company? So how long should Joe's be around if we're going to buy them? Lauren, how long should a company be around?
You mean how long should it have been around in the past, or how long should it be around in the future?
Yeah, what's the future? What's the useful life of a company? What do we expect it to be?
I would say, I guess it depends on.
I love that answer, but but in general, when a company is started, what do we expect its life will be?
I don't know.
Okay.
Shouldn't it be perpetual?
Say that again, Janet.
Shouldn't it be perpetual?
Yeah, ordinarily when a company is started, we presume it's going to be around forever. Okay, so here we've got 5 years of cash flows. Well, what about year 6 and year 7 and year forever? Well, be around forever. Tell that to Sears or Toys R Us. But in general, we assume companies are going to be here forever. So here we have a company, and we know what the cash flows are going to look like for 5 years, but we need to figure out what the cash flows are for year 6 and to forever. So we're going to create a terminal value. This is exactly the way we value companies when we're doing valuation models. And the beauty is they tell us that after year 5, the company is going to start growing at a constant rate forever. That says that we can use the growth rate formula. Okay. So they tell us the growth rate is 3%, and our cash flow in year 5 is 11.3 right down here. So we just pull that number over. So remember, our formula is this one. If we're using the dividend discount model, which is the same thing as a terminal value calculation, it is the cash flow. Dividend discount model, we say it's D1 or D sub 0 times 1 plus G over R minus G. This is the same formula. In this case, it's the cash flow in year 5 times 1 plus the terminal growth rate over the weighted average cost of capital minus the growth rate. There really isn't much to finance. We use the same formulas in everything. We just use them over and over again. So while we just calculated the cash flows in years 1 through 5, this terminal value tells us in year 5 what the cash flows are worth in year 6 through forever. Okay, so we have 5 years worth of cash flows, and then this cash flow of $192 million in year 5 tells us what the firm is worth in year 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 into forever. Okay, so now it's a matter of calculating an NPV. And when we do that, so our cash flows for the NPV, these are the numbers we calculated earlier. The cash flow in year 1 was 7.7 million. The cash flow, and I'm going to go back and show you just to make sure that you understand where these numbers are coming from. These are the numbers we're using right here. So we calculated, we started with EBIT, then we converted all of that to operating cash flow. We subtracted out our capital spending. We subtracted out our net working capital to get our cash flow from assets. And just remember that 7.7 million number, so you'll see that I'm not lying to you. Okay.
Can I see the next screen for a minute?
Yes. That one?
Yeah.
Okay. And look at that, 11.3 million, Janet, is this bottom right number. This number right down
Oh, you
here.
took the 5th year value. Okay, got it.
Okay, the 5th year value. Okay, so that gives us our terminal value. And much like the dividend model, remember we said whatever year the dividend starts growing at a constant rate, we can look at the value of the stock the year before. Here we've got a company that's going to start growing at a constant rate in year 6, which gives us the value of the company in year 5. We need to know what we're going to pay for it today. So we've got to look at all of those cash flows. The cash flow in year 1 is 7.7 million. Year 2 is 8.5, 3, 4. Year 5 is that 11.3 million. That was the bottom right corner, plus the terminal value of 192 million. So that gets us to a cash flow in year 5 of 204 million. This is a straight NPV problem. You can do it in your calculator or in Excel. Our weighted average cost of capital is 9.04%, which gets us to an NPV of 161 million. Okay, so that's the value of the firm. I'm not buying the firm in its totality because they've got debt. So if I'm going to pay to buy this company, I'm only going to pay for the equity. So I've got to figure out what the equity is worth. So I've got to subtract out that debt. And 40 million in debt. So the value of the equity is 121 million. The party store has 1.95 million shares outstanding. So that leaves me with a stock price of 62.17. So if I were buying this company, I'd probably offer 55 to start and know that I can go up to 62.17 based on my forecast, and still that would be a break-even point in terms of value. It would be a zero NPV project at that point if I pay 62.17. Okay, there's one more piece. So before I do the last piece, I want to see if you have any questions on this one.
Can we go back to the terminal value? My numbers don't match yours. I get 181 instead of, I think you got 195.
I did. Let me go back and see. I think you've got a growth rate that's off slightly. Okay. So we have the 11.3 million times 1 plus the growth rate over WACC minus.
Yeah, sorry, I did a minus.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep, got it.
Okay. So that's how we come up with a share price. That's exactly how we value a company. Now,
could I ask you a question?
Yes, Cindy, go ahead.
About the net working capital on the other slide, the prior slide.
Yep.
So I was kind of comparing it to that problem 28 that we did in chapter 6, where we were taking the cumulative amount for the net working capital. So why didn't we do that this time?
Great question, Cindy. Really good question. And it's, I think, probably the most confusing thing on here, and I'm glad you caught it. When we were doing capital budgeting problems earlier, we were looking at incremental net working capital, so the build in net working capital. When we're buying this company, what we're looking at is how much net working capital they're going to need each year. So if we were equating this to what we did in the earlier problem, instead of saying that net working capital is 1.5 million in the first year, 1.6 million, this would be 3.1 million. So this number here would be the addition of these two. The incremental part is the 1.663 million. So this is how much new net working capital they need each year. It's not just the incremental like it was in the earlier problem.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, that's the dollar amount of working capital they use each year. And it's the primary difference between doing a valuation problem and doing a capital budgeting problem. So you've got a going concern that's going to have these working capital needs each year, and they're growing pretty dramatically. Okay.
Carol, I have a question.
Yes.
In reality, if you were evaluating a company to purchase, would you really assume those cash flows that are so far out? I mean, I feel like that's kind of risky.
Yeah.
I mean, how far out do you really go out that far, or would you just assume more short-term cash flows?
What you typically do is value, depending on the company, you typically do a valuation model for about 5 or 6 years because you have to get some sense of what the company is worth. I would never use a growth rate as high as 3%. I typically don't go above a 2% growth, because 3% growth when you're going out 10 and 12 and 20 years, that's tremendous growth. So I typically am more conservative on my growth rates and use a lower number. But yeah, you do typically do a forecast of at least 5 years to get a sense, because you want to look at it and let it pass the smell test or not. Because when I look at these numbers and I'm seeing that my that in year 5 my EBIT's going to be 24.5 million. I want to sit and think about that a little bit. Am I really going to be able to grow Joe's from 16.8 to 20? So in essence, a 50% increase in 5 years. So it causes you to pause and look at it and see if it makes sense to you. That's one of the reasons we go out at least 5 years. And oftentimes, this guy's saying he's going to grow at 10% a year for 5 years. That's aggressive growth. So you might want to do 10% the first year and 4% the next and 2% and 3%. You might want to be a little bit more conservative on your growth rates. But yeah, you ordinarily do at least 5 years, and depending on the kind of organization you're valuing, you may go out further than that. If you were doing Tesla, I think you probably would try to go out more than 5 years, because they're going to experience, you might forecast it to be sort of flat this year as they're working through some of their issues, and really high growth in the next year and the following year, and then maybe pretty high growth the following 2 years, and then maybe a little bit slower. And you may go out a little bit further before you get to sort of a constant state of growth for Tesla, especially given you've got Tesla and SpaceX and Boring Company. So you've got these different companies that are experiencing some pretty high growth right now. So you might take it out even further than 5 years for that company.
Right.
Yeah.
When you use that terminal value, I mean, it adds a significant amount beyond the 5.
Huge.
Yeah, it's huge.
But remember, and that's why I think this growth rate is probably the most important of everything that you do. This number here, I mean, how much is the U.S. economy growing? It typically doesn't grow. It has, in the last 10 years, it hasn't been growing at 3%. It might be around there right now. But 3% says that's forever. That means your company's going to be bigger than the U.S. economy at some point. So that number, the two most important numbers in my mind is your growth rate for the first year, because everything is based off of that first year's growth, and then this terminal value growth. But while 192 million is a large number, that's forever. So we had 11 million just in year 5, and so it's going up a little bit each year. So the present value in year 5 is 192 million. Yeah, those terminal values have a tremendous impact on the overall value of a company. And
Right.
That's why when somebody brings you this and they want to buy a company, question every one of these assumptions in here, especially those two growth rates. Year 1 growth for revenues for the company, in this case EBIT growth, and then whatever that terminal value growth number is. They can be insane.
Got it.
And really get a little scary when you start looking at what the numbers are. Okay, this problem used a terminal value using what we call the Gordon growth model, but you were using it as the dividend discount model. It's the same formula, we just give it different names. Another way of doing this that we usually, if I'm valuing a company, I use this formula as well. You go in and also do a multiples. And there's lots of different multiples you can use. The one that is most commonly used, I did all that, that's where we were. Okay, the one that's most commonly used is an EV/EBITDA multiple. We used to use PE multiples a lot, but lots of companies don't have positive earnings. And then even just look this year with tax consequences of when companies decided to include the tax effect of the new tax laws. PEs are very difficult to calculate and compare across industries depending on how they chose to incorporate the tax change. So EV/EBITDA is a more frequent multiple, and it's your enterprise value divided by your EBITDA. And so what we need is our EBITDA in year 5 to do the calculation. We have EBIT in year 5 was 24.596 million. I'm going to pop back so you can see where that came from. Okay. So EBIT in year 5, are you so glad I'm recording this so you can go back and watch it? Okay, EBIT in year 5 is 24.5 million. I want EBITDA, so I have to add back depreciation of close to 2 million. So our EBITDA is going to be right around 26 million. Let's pop forward there so you can see that. Okay, so our EBIT is EBITDA is 26.5 million. It wants the EV/EBITDA, and it tells us that ratio is 8. So we multiply that 26.56 million by 8 to get a terminal value of 212 million. It's a little bit higher than the earlier one. So if you're being conservative and you want to pay less for Joe's or offer less, you may want to use the earlier model that we looked at. But now we incorporate that 212 million into the cash flow model and come up with an NPV of 166 million. We then go and do the same thing and subtract out the debt to get to the value of equity of 124 million. Divide by the number of shares outstanding. And now, according to this model, you'd be willing to pay $64.92 per share in order to buy up Joe's shares to acquire the company. Let's face it, you are not going to do one of these problems on the test. This is far more detailed. I mean, I'd have to give you 3 hours just for this problem, and then you'd all hate me. But you're not going to have this problem on the test. But you're going to have this problem in life. In all likelihood, you'll see, even if your company never acquires another firm, you'll see that Tesla decides to buy another company or Amazon buys a company. And how do they come up with the price and what they'd be willing to pay? This is exactly what they do. And you know all the pieces. And you could even decide whether or not you think it's a good deal. You can look at what the EBITDA is of a company now and see what kind of multiples are they paying, and does it look like it's a good bargain for the company. It's all what you've learned. It's capital budgeting, and it's coming up with that weighted average cost of capital, and that's how we do valuation. So while this problem is not something that's going to be on the test, understanding how to do this problem means you have really mastered GB 703, because this takes you into valuation and investments and security analysis and all of those upper level finance classes. So it's a hard problem, but you know all the components that are included in this problem. Okay. All right. Now I'm almost afraid to ask, what questions do you have for me on this one? Remember, there's a video. And there were a couple of extra pieces. It's complex, but you really could do this. If I gave you another problem and said, well, let's take a look at it for next time, you could do it. It would take you a little bit, be a little bit of effort. But the exercise of going back through this problem and looking at it, making sure it all makes sense, will help you be much better prepared the next time or in the future if somebody brings you an idea to acquire another company and come up with whether or not the price you're willing to pay has any basis in logic.
Value of the company real quick.
Yep.
The 166, I just missed how you got that.
The 166. Oh, Yep, let me go back one.
I think it's back one slide, yeah.
Yep.
Prof, will you be putting these slides up?
Yes, they're going up as soon as we're done tonight.
Okay.
So the 166 is the NPV of the cash flow stream, and all of the cash flows are the same except in year 5. And in year 5, that's the EV/EBITDA multiple. And the one thing that's different about EV/EBITDA as compared to what you think of as dividend discount model, but we call the Gordon Growth Model, is with Gordon Growth Model, we added the terminal value to the year 5 cash flow. With EV/EBITDA, it's just the terminal value. So the terminal value sort of supersedes the year 5 cash flow. That is one shift between the two types of models. Kyle, you see where the 166 came from? Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. What other questions do you have about this problem? You'll see when I post these, and I'm sorry, we've run long. I threw a couple of other problems in here that I liked from the past that are just good capital budgeting practice problems. So they're going to be at the back of this slide deck if you want a little bit more practice of something besides what's in the book. So they're in here too. Some of them are cost of capital problems. Some of them are capital budgeting kinds of problems. But again, it's nice, different practice for you. Okay, if I don't have any more questions, I'm sorry I kept you so long tonight. Next time, what we're going to do is we'll review for the test, for the final, and then I'm going to cover components of chapter 10, 14, and 16. And don't flip out. It really is not very much. Look at the videos for sure. You can decide whether or not you want to read the chapters, but watch the videos for 10, 14, and 16, and then I just don't think it's right for you to walk out of a finance class without having talked about capital structure, without having a sense for market efficiency. And chapter 10 just talks a little bit, and I'm only going to do a little bit of chapter 10 about where stocks perform in general. So you'll have sort of that sense of the market about you before you exit this class. And we are in person next time. Thank goodness. Hopefully no jittery slides and no questions. I will see you at Legg Mason next Wednesday at 6:30. You guys have a good week.
I do have a question about the WAC project. Just to clarify, for someone who's doing their own company,
Yes.
we don't have to do the Farmer French or the Bloomberg
No.
things. Okay. All right.
You just need to find out how your company does it, answer those questions, and put together a presentation. The big piece, Brian, that I want to know if you're doing your own company is, okay, what do you think about the approach? Is it the right approach? Or do you have recommendations to improve it?
Okay.
Okay.
Hey,
Right.
Prof, if you're doing our own company, do we need to show the data or just basically say, hey, we can take dummy data and say this is how they approach it? Because when I was talking, it's a private company and they said they have a set amount that they take and that's all that they would talk about. And some of the things like risk rate of return, they don't do that because it's internal, and the way they instead do it is they take cost of equity of the market and then that's how they do it.
Okay.
So is that fine, or you still need data to see?
I do not need to see the data. I don't
Okay.
particularly care what numbers your company uses, as long as you can describe the process in enough detail. So what the
Okay.
number is doesn't matter to me. That we use the required return on the market as opposed to an internal number, that's perfectly fine. But just make sure you have enough data to be robust enough without telling me the numbers, because I don't care about the numbers as long as I understand the process that they're going through, and I can tell that you understand the process, and then you can assess the value of the process.
Thank you.
Okay.
And real quickly, the
Yeah.
voice thread is due when? Wednesday?
It's due next Wednesday at noon.
So so a week
You
from
have a
today.
week. Yep, you have 1
Yep.
week. Okay.
Cool. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Any other questions? Bye, guys.
Oh, Professor, I'm
Yes.
sorry. Can you review our slide calculations? I know I had sent you some other Excel